Hello, hello, hello. Happy Tuesday. My name is LaKeesha Hines, and you're watching SOS, where I am saving our sex lives one bedroom at a time. This week, our fearless leader, Mr. Hassani Pettiford and Mrs. Danielle Pettiford, are back in town. We are so happy that Hassani had an amazing birthday and that the Pettifords enjoyed their time in Colombia. I don't know why they didn't put me in the suitcase so I could go too, but maybe next time. So today we're talking about cognitive distortions and how that impacts and has an effect on our sex lives. And so if anyone has experienced any type of cognitive distortion, you may not realize that it impacts every single aspect of your life. And so today we're going to break down what cognitive distortions actually are, and we will break down how they actually impact your sex life or how they could potentially impact your sex life. So I definitely want to say, please, 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 please let me know where you're streaming from so I can shout you out. You know, that's what I love doing. I love to shout out the people. So let me know where you're streaming from. All right. So first and foremost, cognitive distortions, they literally are thoughts that are irrational. They are irrational. And to some extent, all of us might experience one or more of them at some point. But we know that there's always extremes to everything, right? So when the severity or the frequency of these cognitive distortions become extreme, the negative thought patterns literally can impact our well being, and it can ultimately contribute to low self esteem, anxiety, depression, and other mental health challenges. So we definitely have to make sure that we educate ourselves about these cognitive distortions and that we do our best to correct them. There's so many different types of cognitive distortions, and the first thing we have to do is learn about them, which you will learn today. That's the first step in shifting your thoughts and shifting your emotions. And so I don't know if you know this, but the term cognitive distortion was actually coined by Aaron Beck, and he is the father of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. And it's there are some biases, unfortunately, that came about, and they create these negative thought patterns, and they sometimes contribute to the development of unhealthy and unhelpful beliefs about ourselves and the world. So we do have to make sure that we have these um, distortions in check. All right, because our thoughts can be distorted. So we want to make sure that we get them in right standing and get into alignment. All right, so let's jump right in to the very first cognitive distortion. It is polarized thinking. Polarized thinking. And what this is probably the more familiar term is black and white, or all or nothing thinking. And this is when we have the tendency to perceive things in absolutes and extremes. Polarized thinking can affect how we feel about ourselves as well as others. It can make being flexible and acknowledging complexity in situations extremely difficult. Now, how might this polarized thinking show up in your sex life? Well, you may say something like, pleasing my spouse is too hard. I will never be able to please them. It might show up like, I didn't have an orgasm. I'm a failure. Or it can be, I can't believe my spouse didn't ask me if I was satisfied. They're a horrible spouse who does not care about me at all. Do you see how that's an extreme? We're going from one thing to another. I didn't have an orgasm, so ultimately I'm a failure. Like, it's an extreme and it's an absolute. So how do we curb this? The first thing we have to do is reframe this type of extreme thinking to consider that there are gray areas in between the extremes. So for example, a way that we can reframe the first example that I gave you about pleasing my spouse is too hard, I'll never be able to do it. A way to reframe that could be, pleasing my spouse is difficult, but I am capable of facing the challenge. You see how you shift that and move it from an exact to possibilities and create a space of hope. And so, there's one other thing that I think kind of goes hand in hand with a lot of cognitive distortions. And it is a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. And if you're in the corporate world, you have heard this terminology before. A fixed mindset operates in these absolutes, just like this polarized thinking, right? Extremes and absolutes. And so we want to move from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset, because a fixed mindset will say, I'll never be able to please my spouse. It's too hard. I'll never be able to do it. But a growth mindset says, I am having difficulty pleasing my spouse, but I'm open to the challenge and I am willing to do whatever it takes to learn how, so that ultimately one day I will be able to please my spouse. So it leaves the door open for possibilities and for hope. And it's moving from a defeatist mindset to a victorious mindset. And that's what we have to have in everyday life, not just in our sex lives. But today we're talking about sex. So let's keep it on that. Just because it's difficult right now, just because you're struggling right now, doesn't mean that it will always be that way. All right. So I just want to encourage you guys today that just because you may be having a challenge doesn't mean that you'll always have these challenges. Okay. All right. So the next cognitive distortion that we'll talk about today is overgeneralizations. Oh my goodness. Overgeneralizations. So what happens here? This one's similar to polarized thinking as well. And overgeneralizations happen when someone makes these broad interpretations from a single or few events. And this overgeneralization can make it challenging for somebody to remember that every situation and every person is different. A good clue that you might be engaging in this type of cognitive distortion is if your mental vocabulary frequently includes always, never, or every time, blah, blah, blah. You never, blah, blah, blah. I always, you always. When you hear that terminology, a lot of times it is someone who is engaging in this type of cognitive distortion, which is overgeneralization. So, how might this show up in your sex life? It might show up like this. What a horrible conversation that was. I am never going to find the right way to communicate to my spouse what I want in the bedroom. So, because one conversation went bad, now we overgeneralize and say, I'll never be able to communicate what I want, or they'll never be able to understand what I want or give me what I want or need. I don't like any type of foreplay. One time I tried acting out a fantasy and it didn't stimulate me at all. So one time you tried one thing and it didn't work out, then we have to approach every situation as unique in order for us to continue learning about ourselves and the world around us. We have to reassess that foreplay experience. One bad experience doesn't mean that they'll never have a good one. So there's many types of foreplay. Just try a different one and keep trying until you find what you like. So it doesn't have to stop there with that one bad experience. And we don't have to overgeneralize and say that all of foreplay is bad because the one type I tried didn't work for me or didn't do anything for me. All right. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. All right. So the next type of cognitive distortion that we will discuss is catastrophizing. This is a common one. This is a very, very common one, catastrophizing. And this happens when we're only able to see the worst possible outcome of a situation. This mindset can make it so difficult for a person to stay in the present because they're so worried about possible future events. And catastrophizing can also include the belief that what has already happened is irreparable, when in reality, it's not. And when individuals struggle with catastrophizing, their assumptions are usually based on very limited data or evidence. So, how might catastrophizing show up in the bedroom? It may sound like, I don't want to tell my spouse about my fantasies. I know they'll think that I'm weird, or they'll think I'm a freak, or they'll think I'm too much. It might sound like, sex was painful this time. I think I might have cervical cancer. So we go again to catastrophe, and we have to think about the actual likelihood of a catastrophe and consider the possibility of a more positive outcome. So in the case of the painful sex situation, Instead of saying, I think I might have cervical cancer, they might think maybe it was the position that we were in. Maybe that's what it was. Not that it's always going to be painful and I have cancer, right? That maybe it was just a position, and shifting and changing the position that you're in could make it more pleasurable. So again, we don't have to go to catastrophe because it didn't go well that one time. Okay. All right. So the next type of cognitive distortion is personalization. Personalization. So this is the belief that we are, or the individual is responsible for events that they have no control over. When individuals personalize, they find it tough to decipher when a situation is actually related to themselves or not. And how it might show up in your sex life is, it may sound like, my spouse is always irritable. They would be happier if I was a better spouse. So we have to look outside of ourselves and consider other factors may have contributed to the situation, or there are other factors that could provide a logical, reasonable explanation for the situation. So maybe the spouse had a bad day at work, and that's why they're irritable. But you may be thinking that it's your touches or your advances or just the fact that you're trying to initiate sex is what's irritating them. And it's not that. It has nothing to do with you. So when we do this personalization, we have to be very, very careful, because a lot of times it's unreasonable. It's not logical. It doesn't make sense. And again, because you had no control over your spouse's mood and what's happening with them. Only your spouse can control their mood. So you cannot blame yourself for the mood of your spouse. And nor is it your reason you contribute to them being happy or sad. You definitely can make a contribution, but you have absolutely zero control over it. All right. So I hope this is making sense with you guys. I hope this is resonating with you. I have so many more cognitive distortions to go over with you, but we are going to take a quick break. Do not touch that dial. Do not move anywhere. Don't click, don't swipe, don't do anything. I'll be right back. You're watching the SOS show. Welcome back. Welcome back. You're watching SOS. My name is LaKeesha Hines, and today we're talking about cognitive distortions and how this may impact your sex life, how they may show up in the bedroom. Obviously, they can show up in everyday life, but we're specifically talking about how they show up in the bedroom and impact your sex life. I want to go to a question that Veronica had, but before I do that, hello, Evil, Giga, Chad, Mahogany. Marcus Bell, Kimberly, Veronica, Popette, Lindsay. Hello, Virginia. Thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate that and letting me know where you're streaming from and giving me a good morning if you're in a different time zone and all that good stuff. But let's jump to Veronica's question. Veronica said, could cognitive distortions be spiritual? When you get negative thoughts only during intimacy. The reason I ask is because there was a time I had some bad thoughts only while we were intimate and at the time he was in sin. Miss Veronica, I will say 100% absolutely, sis. These cognitive distortions can be spiritual. They absolutely can. Because we have to remember, right? The battlefield is in the mind. And the one thing that the enemy does is he comes for our mind. Because if he can take control of our thoughts, then that will impact the rest of what it is that we do. Remember, if we're talking about a computer system, the brain is our CPU, it is our central processing unit, and the brain controls every single part of the body. It tells the hands what to do, the arms, the feet, the legs. The brain tells us where to go. The brain is actually what processes everything. So people think they actually see with their eyes, and they think they actually hear with their ears, and they think they actually smell with their noses, but that is not the truth. That is not the truth. The eyes are the window. The ears are the opening. The nose is the passageway, the entryway for the smells to come in, for the sounds to come in, for the images to come in. But everything goes to the brain, and the brain processes what it is that it hears and sees and smells, and even what the heart feels. The brain is the one that processes those emotions. So cognitive distortions most certainly start with our thoughts. The enemy attacks our thoughts. What we put into our mind, what we see, or whatever, is all in our thoughts. And so, how we process that information, it most certainly can be spiritual, especially if you are not in direct alignment and in connection with God, which is why it's so important that we stay linked up to God so that He can confirm or correct the thoughts that we're thinking on a daily basis. And I will say too, cognitive distortions sometimes are associated with mental health disorders. So I am not saying that if you have these cognitive distortions that you automatically have a mental health condition, but I am saying that there are times where a mental health condition is present and the cognitive distortions are a symptom of that mental health disorder. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. But yes, it can totally be spiritual. It can totally be spiritual. All right, so let's continue with our cognitive distortions. Let's see, where are we? I think we ended with personalization. So we're on to mental filtering. Mental filtering is our next cognitive distortion. And so mental filtering is also considered a attentional biases. And what happens with this is when people filter information to focus only on the negative aspects of a situation. So a mental filter creates this glass half empty mentality, which makes it hard for people to recognize the complexities of a circumstance. Mental filters can also cause individuals to fixate on perceived mistakes or failures. And so, how mental filtering might show up in your sex life, maybe it might sound like, I know that my performance received stellar reviews before, normally. But one time, there was one person who said that my performance wasn't good. And so, now I could care less about all the other positive reviews that I had. It might sound like I had a great time the last few times my spouse and I had sex, but my spouse didn't say that they enjoyed it too. So I should just stop trying to please them. Instead of seeing everything in a negative light, We have to consider the glass half full option first and focus on what went right in the situation. So rather than being upset that the spouse didn't compliment, be happy that you enjoyed yourself. And then you ask your spouse to confirm or correct their experience. But don't automatically focus on the fact that they didn't say anything, that they didn't confirm that they enjoyed it, that they didn't give you a compliment about how good you performed or how pleased they were, and focus on the fact that they were there, they were present, they agreed to engage in sexual activity with you, because there are a lot of spouses that we are working with at Coast Academy who are not having sex at all and haven't had sex in years. Okay. So if you want to focus on the fact that you didn't get a compliment, I'm saying you could shift that thinking and focus on the fact that at least my spouse is willing to have sex with me. They're here, they're engaged, and whatever. And so, like I said, if you're concerned about your performance, then you just ask them, how was that for you? Did you enjoy that? Is there anything that I can do better? Okay. All right. The next cognitive distortion, discounting the positive. This is a big one too. Similar with discounting the positive is when you ignore positive events or situations that have occurred, right? We just talked about how we go through this mental filtering, but discounting the positive instead of the mental filtering focusing on the negative. Discounting the positive is now we are just discounting whatever positive could come out of the situation. And there are events and situations that actually are positive, but we're ignoring them. So essentially what happens is one is just deciding that the good aspects of the circumstances don't count. And it could be for one reason or another, but they decide that the positive or the good aspect of a situation doesn't count. When we discount the positive, that literally can contribute to low self esteem because it reinforces the notion that you have some type of agency in creating positive circumstances. So, example of how this might show up in your sex life. So, I know that I got it right last night, but that was just luck. I just lucked out. I mean, the positive is you got it right. And if you can't remember what you did that made it right, ask your partner, ask your spouse so you can keep doing whatever you did that worked out right. But don't discount the fact that it was a great experience. So we can reframe these thoughts by actually examining the actual evidence in order to evaluate the situation, get a better sense of the whole picture, not just the negative. So we can tell ourselves that, for example, let's say, you got a job offer. So we could tell ourselves that, we most likely got that job offer because we were qualified. And in that bedroom, you got it right last night because you know what you're doing, because you're qualified to create a pleasurable experience for your spouse. So, don't discount the positive, don't discount yourself, and don't discount the fact that you and your spouse hopefully know each other well enough where you have an idea of what works for them and what doesn't, and what works for you and what does not. I love what Virginia said. Being open helps. Yes, ma'am. Being open absolutely does help. And we have to do that. We have to be open-minded. We have to have an open heart to receive from our spouses, because there are times where our spouses literally are trying to encourage us. They're trying to confirm something for us. But if we are so busy focused on the negative, or we are so into these cognitive distortions, there's nothing that our spouse can say or do to correct that. So this is all happening in our minds, right? It's happening in your mind. So you have to be the one to capture those thoughts and to correct those thoughts, to shift that thinking, to change that negative to a positive. It's your responsibility. And a lot of times, we put that responsibility on our spouses, and it's not their responsibility. It's ours if we're having these negative thoughts. Okay, so the next cognitive distortion, jumping to conclusions. Oh boy. Oh, how many times have we done this, right? When we presume that the meaning of something is one thing with little or no evidence. And it often includes assuming that something will go wrong or something's going to turn out badly. A lot of times this happens with mind reading, right? Where we assume that someone is having a certain thought without the proper evidence. And when we struggle with mind reading, we can create these fantasies about situations that are often disconnected from reality. So, how might this show up in the bedroom? It might show up in the bedroom with, she didn't seem excited. She didn't seem excited about having sex with me. Ugh, she hates having sex with me. These distortions have to be reworked. You have to remind yourself or have your spouse remind you that you cannot know what somebody else is thinking unless you ask them first. We have to reframe this mind reading by considering that other reasons an individual might be acting a certain way or behaving in a certain way, speaking in a certain way. There's another reason why that could be happening. So again, your spouse may have been just tired last night. And that's why they didn't seem excited, because they were just exhausted. But they wanted to, take one for the team, take care of you, make sure you were good. But it's just like sometimes you're not going to be excited. And that's okay. As long as you're fully present, as long as you're not daydreaming, fantasizing, as long as you don't fall asleep, like give them a pass. Because at the end of the day, they're trying to take care of you, if that's what the case is. Okay. All right. So the next cognitive distortion, should statements. Should statements. Where do these come from? These come from the belief that something ought to be a certain way. And when a person struggles with this mindset, their ideas are often very rigid. They leave little space for variety or a variation of other experiences or perspectives. And a lot of times with these should statements, they're very dangerous in marriages and in relationships because they can create these feelings of inadequacy, of guilt, and of stress. And so for example, one how this might show up in your sex life is, um I shouldn't be so upset. I shouldn't be so upset about my spouse not taking care of my needs, not ever wanting to take care of my needs, not ever considering to take care of my needs. I shouldn't be upset about this. So what we have to do then is challenge the should statements. We have to explore why we're placing demands on ourselves. Even if the demand is reasonable, it's important for you to ask, is shoulding yourself motivating you to take action? You have to tell yourself it's okay to be upset, even if you rather not be. The truth is, you are upset. And the more we try to ignore, the more we try to pretend like we're not upset, really what happens is bitterness, anger, and resentment sets in. And now we are responding in these passive aggressive ways with our spouses, and they have no clue why. So, what do you have to do? Have a conversation with your spouse. Let them know what you're thinking and feeling. I feel as if you are not considering me as it pertains to our sex lives. And I want you to be more concerned about what it is that I want and I need. I'm totally good with taking care of you, but I want to be taken care of as well. All right. So the next cognitive distortion, emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoning. Oh my goodness. So what happens with emotional reasoning? The assumption that certain feelings are true despite evidence that might point to the contrary. That might point to the contrary. Okay. So I think emotional reasoning happens because we're emotional. I think it happens because we get emotional. It can lead to an individual being disconnected from reality as they are so caught up in their own emotional experience. I feel like a bad sister or lover, husband, spouse, so I am. I feel like a bad wife, so I am. I feel like a bad mother, so I am. So what we have to do is check the facts of a situation. Feelings aren't facts. So the reality is, you may not have done everything the right way. You may not have shown up as your best self at times, but that doesn't automatically make you a bad spouse or a bad sister or a bad mom or a bad lover. It doesn't. It really doesn't. It means that you have areas of opportunity just like everybody else, and you have an opportunity to course correct and make sure that you don't repeat the same mistakes. All right. The very last cognitive distortion is labeling. Labeling. And that's when we take one characteristic and generalize it to a whole person. This relates to the belief that you or others are static and incapable of change. Okay, so how this might show up in your sex life? Well, he rejected me when I asked him for sex last night. I'm a loser. She rejected me when I asked for a particular type of foreplay. I'm not worthy. She doesn't think I deserve it, right? Labeling can be so damaging. It creates this inflexible way of approaching ourselves and the world around us. So instead of bullying yourself after doing bad, use any mistake as motivation to do better next time. Just use it as motivation. So again, everything is about what our thoughts are. Everything starts in the mind. The battlefield is in the mind. So we have to make sure that we are capturing these negative thoughts and we're doing what we need to do in our best way to correct them. All right. You guys, thank you so much for watching today. Same time next week, Tuesday, 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I love you all. And remember, shift your mind, change your marriage. Have a blessed day, everybody. Peace.